The tragic fate of George Drouillard, a frontier legend amid the boundless and untamed wilderness of what is now Montana. The Jefferson River once carved its path through an unspoiled landscape. Named after President Thomas Jefferson, the river was more than a geographical feature. It was a symbol of the complex realities of the 19th century American frontier. Along its banks, European explorers, fur trappers, and indigenous nations navigated, traded, and at times clashed over territory and survival. It was a place that embodied both the promise and peril of westward expansion. It was along these waters that George Drouillard, one of the most enigmatic and tragic figures of the era, met his untimely end. In 1810, he was killed by warriors of the Blackfoot Confederacy, bringing a brutal close to a life marked by exploration, diplomacy, and survival in a land fraught with danger. Drouillard had risen from a mixed-race youth of promising talent to a legendary frontiersman, celebrated for his indispensable role in the Lewis and Clark expedition. Yet, his death also underscored the collision of two worlds, one driven by the relentless expansionist ambitions of the young American Republic, the other rooted in the long-standing sovereignty and traditions of indigenous nations. In the heart of the Jefferson River Valley, these opposing forces, exploration, commerce, and cultural resistance, converged in a violent and fateful moment, sealing Drouillard's place in history. The river itself had become a crossroads, a meeting point where Euro-American aspirations of conquest clashed with the ancestral lands and customs of the Blackfoot and other indigenous peoples. While it provided water, fish, and fertile soil, it was also an artery through which history flowed, carrying the tides of change that would irrevocably alter the region. The expansion of the United States, propelled by the ideology of manifest destiny, pushed ever westward, but this movement was met with fierce resistance from the indigenous nations who had stewarded these lands for centuries. For them, the arrival of fur traders, settlers, and soldiers was not merely an economic shift, but an existential threat to their autonomy, traditions, and way of life. Thus, George Drouillard's story is not just a personal tragedy. It is a chapter in the broader narrative of the American frontier, a tale of exploration, violence, cultural misunderstanding, and the unyielding struggle for control over land and resources. A frontier in flux, the context of Drouillard's era, to fully grasp the significance of George Drouillard's life and death, one must consider the sweeping transformations of the early 19th century. The United States, still a fledgling nation following its hard-won independence, was eager to expand its territorial reach. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, a momentous acquisition that doubled the country's size, opened vast and largely uncharted territories to American settlers and entrepreneurs. This land grab, spurred by President Thomas Jefferson's vision of an agrarian republic, would have profound and lasting consequences, not only for the United States, but also for the indigenous nations who had lived there for millennia. In the years following the Louisiana Purchase, a surge of settlers, traders, and explorers flooded into the newly acquired lands. But these territories were far from empty. Nations such as the Blackfoot Confederacy had long called these regions home, their societies intricately woven into the land, its resources, and the rhythms of nature. The arrival of fur trappers and traders disrupted these delicate ecosystems, leading to tensions that would escalate into open conflict. The fur trade, which had become a cornerstone of economic expansion, drove much of this westward movement. The high demand for beaver pelts in European fashion markets fueled a competitive and often ruthless industry. Companies like the Missouri Fur Company, which Drouillard joined in the early 1800s, sought dominance over lucrative trading routes, encroaching upon indigenous territories in the process. The Blackfoot Confederacy and other indigenous groups fiercely resisted these incursions, defending their lands, traditions, and way of life against an advancing tide of American and European interests. However, this resistance was frequently misrepresented, cast in the language of civilization versus savagery by those who sought to justify expansion. Yet for the Blackfoot and other indigenous nations, the conflict was not merely a cultural struggle. It was a battle for survival itself. The fur trade was more than an economic enterprise. It was an existential threat to their autonomy, their relationship with the land, and the continuation of their ancestral ways. George Drouillard, a man between worlds, born in 1773 in Detroit, Michigan, George Drouillard was a man of two heritages, his life shaped by the fusion of French-Canadian and Shawnee traditions. His father, Pierre Drouillard, was a soldier, fur trader, an interpreter who instilled in George a deep appreciation for language and diplomacy. His mother, a Shawnee woman, imparted to him the wisdom and customs of her people, providing him with an intimate understanding of the indigenous world. This dual identity made Drouillard a man who could traverse cultural boundaries with remarkable ease, an invaluable skill in the volatile landscape of the frontier. From a young age, Drouillard displayed an extraordinary aptitude for survival in the wilderness. He became an expert hunter, tracker, and frontiersman, but his most invaluable asset was his linguistic prowess. Fluent in French, English, Shawnee, and the sign language widely used among Plains tribes, he possessed a rare ability to facilitate communication between disparate cultures. It was this skill set that earned him a place in the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition, where he proved indispensable as both an interpreter and a guide. Drouillard's role in the expedition cemented his legacy as one of the great frontiersmen of his time. He was renowned for his fearlessness, adaptability, and unshakable composure in the face of adversity. Yet his ability to navigate the complex world of the frontier was not enough to shield him from its dangers. In 1810, while trapping beaver along the Jefferson River, Drouillard and his party were ambushed by Blackfoot warriors. The attack was part of the broader hostilities between indigenous nations and the encroaching fur trade, which threatened both their resources and sovereignty. Though a seasoned and resourceful survivalist, Drouillard was ultimately overpowered and killed, a tragic end for a man who had spent his life walking the line between two worlds. His death, however, was more than the loss of an individual. It was a moment that encapsulated the volatile nature of the American frontier. As the forces of expansion, commerce, and resistance continued to shape the West, the Jefferson River, where Drouillard met his fate, remained a silent witness to the relentless march of history. Today, George Drouillard's story endures as a testament to the complexities of the frontier era, a narrative of exploration, cultural conflict, and a fragile balance between survival and ambition. His life and death serve as a reminder of the people who shaped and were shaped by the vast and often unforgiving landscape of early America. The Lewis and Clark expedition, a nation's bold venture in 1804, when the Lewis and Clark expedition embarked on its historic journey, the United States was still a fledgling nation, eager to assert its sovereignty over the vast and largely uncharted lands acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson envisioned the expedition not only as a means of mapping these new territories, but also as a diplomatic mission, one aimed at establishing peaceful relations with the indigenous nations that had long called these lands home. Among the most vital members of this expedition was George Drouillard, who joined as a hunter, scout, and interpreter. His contributions were indispensable. His tracking and hunting expertise ensured that the expedition had a steady supply of food, while his linguistic and diplomatic skills facilitated interactions with various indigenous nations. Frequently sent ahead of the main party, Drouillard scouted dangerous terrain, negotiated safe passage, and helped navigate the vast wilderness. Despite his crucial role, however, Drouillard's name never gained the same historical prominence as that of Meriwether Lewis or William Clark. His relative obscurity reflects a broader pattern in historical narratives that often overlook the contributions of indigenous peoples and individuals of mixed ancestry. Though he operated in the shadows of history, his efforts were no less significant in shaping the success of the expedition. The perils and promise of the fur trade by 1810 6 years after the completion of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Drouillard had left government service and fully immersed himself in the perilous world of the fur trade. He became a key figure in the Missouri Fur Company, founded by the ambitious fur trader Manuel Lisa, who sought to expand American commercial influence deep into the Rocky Mountains. With his deep knowledge of the terrain, his fluency in multiple languages, and his unmatched tracking skills, Drouillard was a natural fit for the enterprise. Yet the fur trade was not for the faint of heart. Trappers and traders ventured into remote and often hostile territories, where they faced extreme weather, dangerous wildlife, and the ever-present risk of violent confrontations with indigenous groups who viewed the encroaching fur trade as a threat to their way of life. These men, known as mountain men, often operated in solitude, relying solely on their survival instincts, skills, and understanding of the land. Their very presence, however, fueled rising tensions. The Blackfoot Confederacy, in particular, saw fur trappers as interlopers who depleted their resources and disrupted their delicate ecological balance. As the fur trade expanded, competition between rival companies intensified, leading to escalating conflicts along the frontier. The Blackfoot, who controlled a vast swath of territory critical to the trade, had long resisted European and American encroachment. Renowned for their military prowess, they fiercely defended their lands and way of life. To the Blackfoot, the fur trappers were more than mere traders. They were invaders who threatened both their sovereignty and survival. For Drouillard, operating in such a volatile environment required both caution and skill, but his independent nature often drove him to push into regions others hesitated to enter. His final journey along the Jefferson River in 1810, where he was ambushed and killed by Blackfoot warriors, serves as a stark reminder of the immense risks that came with frontier life and a mounting struggle between indigenous nations and American expansionism. The Blackfoot Confederacy, Guardians of the Plains. The Blackfoot Confederacy was one of the most powerful and influential indigenous alliances of the northern Great Plains. Comprised of three closely related nations, the Siksika, Kainai, Blood, and Piikani, Piegan, the Confederacy ruled over a vast expanse stretching across present-day Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Their deep spiritual connection to the land was woven into their way of life, particularly their relationship with the bison, which provided them with food, clothing, shelter, and essential tools. Famed as expert horsemen and formidable warriors, the Blackfoot also possessed strong diplomatic acumen, negotiating alliances and defending their interests against external threats. However, as the United States expanded westward, they increasingly viewed the influx of settlers, traders, and trappers as an existential threat. The fur trade disrupted their traditional hunting grounds, while the introduction of European goods, especially firearms and metal tools, destabilized the balance of power among indigenous nations. Determined to preserve their lands and sovereignty, the Blackfoot fiercely resisted outside incursions. Their conflicts with fur traders and explorers were not merely about economic competition. They were battles for survival, cultural preservation, and control over their ancestral homeland. The growing presence of American and European traders posed a direct challenge to their autonomy, and they responded with a sustained campaign of resistance. Drouillard's fate at the hands of Blackfoot warriors was not an isolated event, but part of this larger struggle, one that would continue to define the shifting power dynamics of the American frontier for decades to come. His life, like that of so many who lived and died on the edges of civilization, was shaped by the promise and peril of a rapidly changing world. The Blackfoot perspective, defending sovereignty and tradition to the Blackfoot Confederacy, the fur trade, was not simply an economic enterprise, it was an existential threat. It undermined their sovereignty, disrupted their way of life, and desecrated their sacred relationship with the land. The trappers were not seen as mere traders. They represented a larger encroaching force, one that sought to impose a foreign way of life and erode the traditions that had sustained the Blackfoot for generations. A fatal expedition. The final journey of George Drouillard in the spring of 1810 George Drouillard set out on what would become his final expedition, intending to trap along the Jefferson River. It was a familiar route, one he had traveled many times during his years in the fur trade. Yet, this journey carried a greater sense of danger. Tensions between fur trappers and the Blackfoot Confederacy had escalated, and the region had become increasingly perilous for outsiders. Despite the risks, Drouillard was undeterred. He placed his trust in his extensive experience, his deep knowledge of the land, and his understanding of indigenous cultures. He had long navigated treacherous territory with skill and caution, believing that his expertise would see him through once more. When he failed to return to camp after several days, concern began to spread among his companions. A search party was sent out, and after days of searching, they came upon a grim discovery: Drouillard's lifeless body near a creek. The evidence suggested he had been ambushed by Blackfoot warriors. The precise circumstances of his death remain uncertain, but signs at the scene indicated he had fought fiercely before being overwhelmed. His death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a sobering loss for the frontier community, marking the perils of an era defined by both opportunity and conflict. Drouillard was far more than a skilled trapper and hunter. He was a bridge between cultures. His ability to communicate with indigenous nations, his linguistic talents, and his survival skills made him an invaluable figure in the fur trade and frontier diplomacy. His passing signified more than just the end of his own journey. It marked the fading of an era when the frontier, though full of promise, remained an unforgiving and unpredictable domain. A life cut short, a legacy remembered. George Drouillard's name has often been eclipsed by the towering figures of Lewis and Clark, yet his contributions were no less vital. He played an essential role in the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition, ensuring the survival of the party through his hunting, tracking, and diplomatic skills. His tragic death in 1810 underscored the ever-present dangers of the frontier and the complex, often fraught relationships between Euro-American settlers and indigenous nations. Though Drouillard never achieved the same renown as Lewis or Clark, his life remains a testament to the hardships, challenges, and contradictions of the American frontier. He was a man who straddled two worlds, adeptly moving between the European and indigenous spheres with rare skill and finesse. His untimely death, caught between the forces of American expansion and indigenous resistance, was a tragic yet fitting conclusion to a life spent navigating the ever-shifting boundaries of a contested land. Expanding the legacy, broader themes, and lessons, the story of George Drouillard extends far beyond the life of a single individual. His experiences illustrate the broader conflicts and contradictions that define the American frontier. As a man of mixed heritage who served both the U.S. government and indigenous groups, his life and death reflect the larger struggles over land, power, and identity that shaped the history of the American West. At its core, Drouillard's story is one of cultural collision, one world expanding, the other resisting. It is a story of resource exploitation and the disruption of indigenous ways of life. It is a tale of opportunity clashing with survival, ambition challenging tradition. These themes are not confined to history books. They continue to resonate today. Drouillard's legacy forces us to confront the consequences of imperialism, colonization, and the relentless pursuit of economic gain at the expense of established cultures. His story challenges us to reflect on the cost of progress and the price of unchecked ambition. Above all, his life serves as a reminder that the history of the American frontier was not solely written by those who pushed westward, but also by the indigenous nations who fought to protect their lands, their people, and their way of life. A tragic hero of the frontier, George Drouillard stands as a poignant symbol of the contradictions that shaped the American frontier. His life was one of courage, resilience, and adaptability. It was also marked by the greater forces of history that reshaped the land and its people. As we look back on his life, we are reminded of the precarious balance between opportunity and danger, the complexities of cultural exchange, and the profound impact of westward expansion on indigenous nations. In the end, Drouillard's story is not just the tale of one man's journey, but a reflection of the broader history of the American West. His life serves as a testament to the intricate and often brutal nature of history, a reminder of those who lived on the fringes of society, navigating a world that was rapidly transforming before their eyes. Though his death was a tragic loss, it remains a fitting conclusion to a life defined by survival, knowledge, and the ceaseless pursuit of understanding in a world teetering on the edge of change.